Great, okay. So I'm Dee Secker, the Diversity and Inclusion Director at Chambers and Partners. And I'm delighted that we have an eminent lawyer with us today, joining us from Poland, in fact. We have Professor Leslie Thomas QC. And thank you very much for joining us today, Leslie. We're really looking forward to having this conversation with you and you know, not only finding out about your own career journey within the legal profession, but also the number of vulnerable communities you've helped through your professional work. So thank you so much for joining us, Leslie.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here.
Wonderful. So I thought we could start off really by reflecting on your own journey. Obviously, you're Queen's Counsel, you've reached the sort of highest realms of your profession, and I thought it'd be wonderful to just get some insights into your own beginnings in the legal profession. You know, what made you decide to be a lawyer, and how did you find your initial journey into the profession?
Well, it wasn't easy. I think from a relatively young age, I think I probably was about 13, 14, I really wanted to become an advocate. I didn't know that the advocate that I wanted to be was known as a barrister, because where I grew up and where I came from, we didn't really have lawyers that we knew. I grew up in South London. I went to a comprehensive school, and in terms of having powerful role models who were professionals, that was a rarity. I don't think anybody in my family knew anybody who was, you know, really in the professions. My mother was an auxiliary nurse. My father was a technician for British Telecom. You know, he used to go around, you know, fixing telephone lines and that sort of thing. And as I say, in my school, I remember being, you know, fairly active in our social studies and thereafter sociology classes, and I used to challenge my teachers often. I do remember that, and I thought, let me not accept everything that's put in front of me as sacred. Let me ask questions. And from a relatively early stage, I found myself questioning, and I thought to myself, oh, it'd be really good if I could become a lawyer. I wanted to become an advocate. The other thing that influenced me in this is that I saw a lot of injustice around me. I didn't want to be part of a school cohort who bullied other children, and bullying was quite a big thing in my school. You know, lots of vulnerable kids were picked upon, and I often found myself standing up for them. I wasn't one of the kids who was picked on, but I often sided with, you know, the more vulnerable kids in my school, and I found that made me, you know, not particularly popular, but people didn't bother me, and that was something that meant a lot to me. I just didn't like to see that sort of injustice, and so I got it into my head that this is what I wanted to do, and I set myself a goal to do it, and I pursued that doggedly, despite the fact that I had a number of setbacks. So I didn't do particularly well in my O-levels, as they then were called, GCSEs. I had to retake them. I didn't do particularly well in my A-levels. I had to retake them, and I remember being at a careers day. Do you remember those careers officers? Did you have a careers officer? I don't know what qualifies them to give careers advice, but I remember my careers officer saying to me, when I said that I was interested in becoming a barrister. By this time, I knew what a barrister was. I knew those were lawyers that wore the wigs and argued in court. And this careers officer said to me, "No, no, you don't want to do that. You'll be much better off." And there were two jobs that this careers officer suggested. One was to become a mechanic. I have no interest in mechanics. And secondly, was to get a good job in Tesco's. And that was the advice that my careers officer gave me. And I just ignored them. I just didn't think that careers advice was worth the paper it was written on. I got my first big break when, having retook my A-levels, you know that they give you predicted grades. Now, my predicted grades weren't great, having failed them once. But I went for an interview at Kingston, as it then was Polytechnic, now Kingston University. And there was a professor of law there, a lecturer, Professor Penny Derbyshire, who interviewed me. And I don't know what it was, but Penny saw something in me and decided to give me a chance and gave me an unconditional offer to go to Kingston. And this is really interesting because had she not given me that unconditional offer, that break, had I not been made that offer, I don't know if I'd be here today. And it's really interesting because oftentimes when we are recruiting, we look for candidates and we try to recreate our own image of candidates. So it's often you have law firms or chambers or universities, just recreating what they know and not giving other people who may have as equal qualities but different qualities an opportunity. And the problem with that is that you just keep on recreating images of yourself. Now, Penny Derbyshire, Professor Derbyshire, gave me a chance, and I didn't let her down. I went from strength to strength. My first year at university wasn't particularly great. I was just getting it, but how to do assignments, essays and all the rest of it. But this is just technique that you can learn. And once I had learned that, I went from strength to strength from my second and third year, and I came very near the top of my university and did so well there that another professor there and another person who I owe a lot to, that's Professor Robert Upex, who was he was the head of the law school when I was there, and also an employment lawyer. And he just gave me another chance that I am very thankful for, in that he arranged a pupillage for me with one of his friends at the bar. Now, this was this was over 30 years ago, and this was a time when there was very little equal opportunities. It would be unheard of today to sort of like ask a friend to give somebody a pupillage, without going through proper interviews, allowing everybody an opportunity to apply for the post. But it worked back then for me because in fact it worked in a really strange way, because I got to do this pupillage with this fantastic barrister, a man called David Richardson, who was I would describe him as a semi-commercial PI lawyer. And he took me under his wing. He gave me the most amazing training. A barrister's training, as you know, is known as a pupillage. I spent a year with him learning everything about drafting and what I needed to know, which was just amazing. And I think that opportunity, I will, always remember Robert Upex for, because he just opened that door for me. After I did my pupillage, obviously between university and my pupillage, I did bar school, and I did very well at bar school. But after I did my pupillage, I was at this, semi-commercial firm, set of chambers, and I realised that whilst the work was very, good, and I probably would have done very well in that area of law, it wasn't where my heart lay. I wanted to do more social justice type cases, and so I spent many an evening, despite the fact that I didn't need to. I didn't do it to build a CV. I did it because I wanted to help communities. I spent many an evening volunteering for various law centres around London. So I was literally, 4 nights a week. Yeah, each week of the year, I was doing a different law centre, volunteering. And it was a time when the law centre movement was looking for young volunteers to come and help. So I did Clapham and Stockwell. I did Central London Law Centre. I did a stint for Liberty, or as it then was, it was called the National Council for Civil Liberties, now Liberty. And I, again, was given another lucky break then there, because I remember at one of the Liberty dues, it was I think it was just before Christmas, they had a social function, and I met a man known as Tony Gifford, Lord Gifford, who was the head of chambers at Wellington Street, and I got speaking to him. I told him what I was doing at this commercial set, and he said, "Why are you doing that?" He goes, it seems to be a bit incongruent with what you're doing at Liberty and the values you've just told me about. Why don't you come along to my chambers? And he invited me. Little did I know it at the time, it was for an interview, but I didn't know. I thought I was just going to his chambers to meet some of his people there, some of the barristers working there. But I went to Wellington Street, and they interviewed me on the spot and took me on. I had literally 4 days to decide whether or not I was going to stay at the initial set of chambers or join Wellington Street. And I decided that Wellington Street was where I wanted to be, because they were doing work that I really admired. At the time they were doing what I would describe as unpopular cases. So they were representing the miners. I came in just at the end of the miners, when they were doing some of the civil litigation involving the miners following the miners' strike. They were doing a lot of the Irish cases. So they were doing the Birmingham 6, Guildford 4, and it was a really exciting time to be a junior member of chambers. And I got amazing training, a different type of training, but this time in social justice cases. So this is where I had a fantastic mentor, a barrister known as James Wood, who's at he's now at Doughty Street, but he was one of my supervisors at Wellington Street when I first went there, and he taught me about police law and police action. So that's where I learned that. So that's the 5-minute version, but that's how I entered the profession.
And it sounds that, Leslie, you've had both the sort of commercial training, and obviously later on looking at social justice and obviously police law becoming your main focus. That's something that we've seen, particularly in the last few months, and not just looking at the UK and US. There's also a number of cases coming out of countries like Brazil, where this is an extremely topical area. So I wondered, putting your sort of day job hat on, if you could tell us a bit more about these implications, and the very tragic circumstances around George Floyd, the impact that's now happening, not only in a sort of grassroots community activism way, but also we're seeing companies come out with statements, and what do you make of all of that?
My feelings are mixed. And the reason why that is what happened to George Floyd, what I describe as horrific murder, not just a killing. He was murdered. If the Minneapolis prosecutors can describe it as a murder, I don't think we should shy away from describing that George Floyd was murdered by 4 police officers. And I say my feelings are mixed for 2 main reasons. Firstly, it cannot be denied the way that his death has moved the world globally. This has had a national and international impact in relation to the rights, or the wrongs, I should say, done to people of colour, and in particular Black people, people of African descent. And that has to be a good thing if that moves the conversation forward and enables those who hold the balance of power to make changes, to allow a greater and more inclusive platform for you know, all people, and in particular Black people. But the other thing that I think and feel is this is nothing new. What happened to George Floyd has been happening certainly in the UK for years. And I can give you cases that I have been involved in where people have been, okay, they may not have had a knee on their neck, but they've been restrained in such a way that they've been killed, or the restraint has contributed to their death, or they've been treated in a really inhumane way. And, you know, the list goes on. So let me just give you some examples of cases that I've been involved in. So, you know, there was the death of Wayne Douglas in the mid-90s. This is one of the very first cases that I was involved in, where the concept of positional asphyxia, where somebody's restrained in the prone face down position and they're cuffed behind their back, and weight is applied to their back and they die. And you know, positional asphyxia is a contributing factor in their death. That's, you know, that happened, or was partly responsible for George Floyd's death, and that happened in that case. Then there is the case of Christopher Older, the infamous case of Christopher Older. Christopher was the Black paratrooper who died on the custody floor in a Hull police station, having been left with his trousers around his thighs, his body and his privates exposed, and he died face down, choking on his own fluids and vomit, while, you know, 5 white police officers stood around joking and laughing until he died on CCTV. And you hear Christopher, you know, breathe his last breath and gurgle his last sound before police officers realize that he's died just in front of them. Now, Christopher's death, when I first saw the CCTV of that tragic and horrific death, moved me to tears. In the same way that George Floyd's death has moved thousands of people to tears. You may be wondering, well, when did Christopher die? Christopher died in 1998. Why haven't we heard much about Christopher's death, despite the fact that it's been captured on camera? For this reason, and this is a real difference between Floyd's death and Older's death. Floyd's death was made public with the advent of social media. The video was shared widely, it came into people's homes, and I suppose, particularly in a period of lockdown where more of us are now using our devices, that came into everybody's home. Whereas when Christopher died, the police did everything they could to suppress the wide watching of that video. You can't see Christopher's death on video because it's the property of the police. And after the inquest, although it was shown for the inquest, we all were made to sign undertakings not to release it. And after the inquest, there's not been a proper footage or leakage of what happened to Christopher put out there. And you see, the power of the camera is extremely potent. I think that we would have had a similar reaction. There would have been a greater reckoning if what happened to Christopher had been made more widely public. But it doesn't stop there. And then, the death of Ibrahim Say. I did Christopher's case in 2000. I did Ibrahim Say. He was the first black man who died following the use of CS spray on him. And that was back in, again, the early 2000s. And then you move forward, you've got, in 2012, I did the case of Sean Rigg, the musician who was restrained by 4 white police officers in Brixton. Sean had a mental health crisis. The public called for the police officers and they restrained him. And they restrained him in such a way that, again, he was restrained and prone face down with officers on his back. And it was only because a vigilant member of the public from an apartment block took 2 photographs in 2 different points of time, about 9 minutes or so apart from each other, which showed the police officers on his back from point A to point B. And that was the only way we knew. Because initially the police officer was saying, oh, they just put him to the floor, they had him on his back, they had him in that position for a short period of time until he was cuffed, and then they rolled him on his side. And then when the photographs, the 2 photographs from 2 different points in time came forward, and with some pointed questions about whether or not they had released him or had to put him back down on the ground, they said no. That meant that he was in that position throughout that entire period. And it doesn't stop there, because even today I'm instructed in a number of cases whereby people saying I can't breathe, being restrained for a long time, are currently before courts. I can think of 4 cases. I won't mention them because those cases are currently running through the courts, but there are 4 cases currently which raise very similar issues to George Floyd's death. So the point that I make is this, and why I say I had mixed. It's one thing saying, let's do something about this, but none of this is new. And there have been, and it's been acknowledged that a disproportionate number of, particularly men of African descent, that's African Caribbean men, or men from whose home countries are on the continent of Africa, have been killed disproportionately by police forces. And when I hear, as I heard just the other day, President Trump in the States saying more white people are killed by law enforcement agencies than black people, he's been disingenuous, because the point is, if you look at the statistics of how many black people there are in the States, or how many black people there are in the UK, and then you look at the numbers of black people who are stopped and searched, or who are tasered, or who are killed whilst in custody, the numbers are disproportionately high, much higher. And that's the point. And there needs to be a reckoning, there needs to be accountability for this. So, George Floyd's death, it's raised a topic. I think it's good that that topic's being discussed. Let's hope that it's not just talk, but action follows.
And thank you for sharing some of those cases and highlighting some of those names that, you know, for a majority of people who are watching or listening to this, they may not have heard of those cases. And so thank you for sharing that as well. I know back in 2017, David Lammy sort of produced a report looking at the criminal justice system and covering a couple of the areas that you've mentioned there in terms of disproportional effect of, you know, especially in terms of black men in the criminal justice system. So we're now 3 years on. Do you feel that that report has raised anything to the surface or any action has been taken? What would you say would need to be the next steps?
No, yeah, the irony is, you know, the Lammy report was telling us what we already knew, but it was great that he, you know, commissioned it. He brought the stats out so we could all see just how blatant the stats were. And this is, you know, how black people in particular, black boys, young black men are disproportionately affected throughout the criminal justice system. So from, you know, stops and searches, from the decisions to give them cautions, from the decisions to prosecute and charge them, the impact of sentencing. You know, the Lammy report was very thorough and showed disproportionality affecting people of African descent throughout, and also, you know, young Muslim men, you know, so black men and brown men. But here's the thing. Despite the fact that was 3 years ago, nothing has been done. And yet, just last week, we have the Independent Office of Police Conduct talking about conducting yet another report. Look, we are getting report tired. How many reports do they need to commission before solid action is taken? There are reports that have been done. We don't need to have commission reports every couple of years to tell us what we already know. We had in 1999 the Macpherson report that was talking about how the certainly in the Metropolitan Police Force, and the Metropolitan Police were not the only force that were inflicted with the disease of institutional racism. You know, I think the time for commissioning reports has come and gone. We've got many reports which show differential treatment. Now is the time for action.
And Leslie, obviously, we're both, as our day jobs, we work in and around the legal profession. What advice would you give to law firms, to chambers, even to clients, in-house counsel around this area in terms of what we can do? We've seen a number of firms, a number of chambers step out and post solidarity. I know that the Law Society, for example, posted a statement on solidarity with the Black community. But beyond that public statement, and as you say, action needs to be taken across the board. What would your advice be? What can people do in terms of a tangible, practical way in which to help the Black community now?
All right, so let me suggest a 5-point plan of action, and this is something that we at the Bar Council are looking at. So these are some ideas. When I say Bar Council, I mean the Bar Standards Board. I'm a member of the Bar Standards Board, and we've got a race equality task force, and there's a group of, you know, dedicated, fantastic people who are thinking about how we can improve the situation of people of colour. And so some of the ideas I'm about to share come from there, some of the ideas are my own. But the first thing is, I think whether you're a law firm or whether you're a set of chambers, or indeed most professions, right, I think the first thing you need to do is you need to do an audit of your organisation, and that is, you know, having an honest and open conversation with your colleagues, your staff, in relation to how you are dealing with race. And one way of doing it is to ask, you know, people within your organisation how you are doing, and that means, you know, you might want to have an anonymous questionnaire with a series of questions surrounding race, You know, is there a safe space? Do I know who I can go to if there's an issue? You know, so sometimes it may not be practicable to have a safe space, because if you're an organisation with only one black person working there, it's going to be pretty obvious who's being talked about. But that in itself may be saying something about your organisation. And so an honest look, right? So that's number one. Number two, I think if people are genuinely concerned about, you know, changing the current status quo, because there's a recognition that the status quo is built and based on a false and a racist narrative, and you know, that's the reality. I'm afraid, given our history of colonialism, that there are good reasons. When I say good reasons, there are logical reasons why people of colour traditionally have been held back, and that's to do with racist institutions, which many of these institutions and professions have been built on in the past. That is fact. That is history, and that needs to be acknowledged. In the same way that when we walk down our major high streets and we see statues of, you know, racist slave owners, you know, solid bronze, stone, and rock, you know, those are institutions, those are, you know, monuments that we can touch. Well, in the same way, the way that many of these structures, which may be hidden from us or not initially apparent, they are there and they are real, and they hold, you know, certain people back. So what can you do apart from just talking? Well, you need to have proper anti-racist education, and coupled with proper anti-racist education, you need proper anti-racist training. The education and the training are not the same thing. And you know, before, if you're listening to this, before you say, well, we do unconscious bias training, that ain't it. That's not what I'm talking about. Unconscious bias training does not work. You need to understand, and you need to educate yourself as to what it means to be an anti-racist, and not, you know, if you are one of my white colleagues listening to this, there is a natural tendency to think, oh, this is about me. This is about, you know, whether I am a racist. No, this is not about you, and there shouldn't be that defensiveness, or what I call white defensiveness, or what Robin DiAngelo calls in her book white fragility. It's not about you, it's about a situation, and it's an acknowledgement of the situation. And yes, these conversations are going to be uncomfortable. They are uncomfortable when you are talking about injustice, and when you realize that, you know, you may, because of the color of your skin, you may never have had to question things that have been easier for you than it is for somebody who is a person of color. That makes you feel uncomfortable. I get it, but despite the fact that I get it and you feel uncomfortable, we need to get over it and move on and move forward. So number two, proper anti-racist education. You need to educate yourself, and there's some really good books you can start with. I've mentioned DiAngelo's White Fragility. That's a good place to start. Another fantastic book is a book by Kendi, which is, you know, how to be an anti-racist. And you know, there's a really, if you just look on Twitter, you'll see a series of books that people are sharing in relation to educating ourselves. And everybody needs to educate themselves. Even I have been educating myself on anti-racist literature and how to be an anti-racist, because we're all impacted by these structures, which you know, are pervasive and hidden. next, I would say it's really important that, you know, if you are in a position of power, if you are part of the white majority, black people can't do this on their own. We just can't, because we don't hold the power. So we need senior white allies, who will come and be supportive. So think about becoming a white ally. It reminds me of what Maya Angelou said, and it's a lovely quote. She said this: "It's impossible to struggle for civil rights, equal rights for blacks, without including whites, because equal rights, fair play, justice are all like the air. We all have it, or none of us have it. That's the truth of it." And that's a beautiful quote that just it you know, embodies this sentiment. So we need senior white allies who are prepared to stand alongside us and call out these racist structures and be prepared to change them. Fourthly, I think it's really important that organisations put out proper anti-racist statements. You know, and can I tell you what is not an anti-racist statement? It's not good enough to say we believe in equal opportunities. That's not an anti-racist statement, because we've been saying, and organisations have for years been saying, we believe in equal opportunities, but it's not equal opportunities. That's the thing. This is moving beyond calls for equality. Equality does, you can have a system that on the face of it looks like it's providing equality of opportunity for all, but still disproportionately impacts in a negative way on people of colour. We need to go beyond that. We need more equity, a recognition of the structures and how the structures impact on people, than just talking about equality of opportunity, because equality of opportunity doesn't cut it, nor does just bland statements saying we stand with you. What does we stand with you mean? We need proper anti-racist statements, and to be able to do that, it's a recognition that structures are inherently racist, and that needs to, and before you can even get to that stage, you need to educate yourself. And then finally, I think there needs to be positive action program. For all too long, there have been disproportionate numbers of people of colour not making it. We are too few in number, and I think it's really important that we redress that. And so positive action programs are necessary. And let me say something. For those who are ready to shout out and say, oh, talk about positive discrimination, this is going to, dumb down an organisation. Well, firstly, I find that insulting and not the case. The example I gave in relation to myself, really only when we started this conversation about how I was taken on at Kingston, I think that was the recruitment at Kingston, looking at Kingston, because when I first went, it was predominantly white. There were only, when I went to Kingston when I started at Kingston in 1984, there were only 5 people of colour in my year, and my year was a year of 80, and there were 5 people of colour, and I was the only African Caribbean man in my year. We had 2 other African Caribbean women. We had 1 woman that was mixed, and we had, and I think, so I said 5. I think we had 2 brown women. So, you can see how a decision that was made to give me a chance you know, I think it paid off. I think Kingston are very proud of what I've been able to do during my career. And I've got everything to thank Kingston for, because they took positive action. They looked at me, they interviewed me, they took me on, not just based on A-level results, but they had an interview, they tested me in an interview, and they saw that I had interesting things to say, that, you know, I was an intelligent person, and perhaps I didn't do very well in the A-levels, but they went beyond that. And that's what organizations need to do. We need to be more creative in how we plan for the future and how we recruit. There is not just one model of recruitment. And that's what organizations, whether it be the bar, whether it be solicitors, whether it be other professions, need to understand. There's more than one doorway through, and they need to unlock the door, because oftentimes organizations and the heads of those organizations are the gatekeepers. So those are how about that as a series of things that organizations could start with?
I think that's a wonderful 5 starting points and actionable points that people can take away. So thank you for sharing that. Obviously, we're doing this interview remotely, and we're all impacted by the recent events of COVID, and particularly now, especially in the UK, there was an announcement that 650,000 people have lost their jobs over lockdown. In these times of deeply uncertain times, people often say that all the hard work, particularly in terms of diversity and inclusion, fall to the ground. There's less budgets available, it's less of a priority. You know, when we look at what happened in 2008, between 2003 and 2008, I think good progress was being made in the profession with starting out looking at diversity and inclusion initiatives. We then had the 2008 recession, which a number of people have said sort of has put us back a few years, and it looks like we're heading in that direction in terms of the economic fragility around the world. What do you think is going to happen? How do you think this sort of new normal will affect diversity and inclusion? In some ways, we're seeing, as you've just mentioned, the awful death of George Floyd being beamed into people's homes, and now we're seeing some conversations around that may not necessarily have happened. But what do you feel, where are we in terms of that crossroads of D&I in the legal profession? Do you think we'll be taking steps forward, or do you think it will be hindered by the wider global situation?
Well, I suppose the first thing to say is it's really difficult to make predictions because I don't have a crystal ball. But the one thing I can say, and I can say with confidence, is COVID isn't going anywhere soon. I have little doubt in my mind that COVID is certainly going to be affecting us until the year end, and probably into next year. It may well be that COVID is one of those diseases that we just have to live with. So I think we start with that. I think we start with the fact that COVID is going to be here for some time. The next thing that I think we can probably guess is that the way that we work has significantly changed. I think organizations have been surprised, some of them pleasantly so. Those are the organizations that have, managed to continue, and some even thrive despite a COVID era with remote working. Now, the thing is that there are many organizations, and there are many types of work where we just can't work remotely. And indeed, it's very difficult for certain sections in our society to work remotely, even if we can. There's access to the internet, there's good access to the internet, there's the fact that people have children at home, and there's who you have at home. And again, one of the things that I argued about a week ago when I was making some submissions to Grenfell is that poverty, and I don't think you can ignore poverty. Poverty is inextricably linked with race. Why is that? Is because a lot of people of colour, you've got a higher proportion of people of colour in working class backgrounds who have free school meals, if that's the standard upon which you judge it. And therefore, these sections of our society have been and will continue to be impacted more greatly, more significantly, despite some of the protective measures that have been put in place to protect people. So, a lot of the frontline workers have been in the health system have been people of colour, because traditionally people of colour have worked in the front line in the health system. Our health system would collapse were it not for people of colour. You remember I said to you, my mother was a nurse for many years before her retirement. And so these, it doesn't surprise me that people of colour have been impacted disproportionately. Whether that's been frontline healthcare workers, or people who've been driving buses or working on the tube, or just keeping our society going. Key workers. That's because a lot of the key workers are, in lower paid jobs and are people of colour. So, I can't give predictions, as I said at the just the beginning of this topic. But what I do feel is COVID is going to be with us for significant time to come, and unfortunately and tragically, a lot of people are going to die or become very ill, which is a real tragedy in itself. And of those people who are going to be affected, a significant proportion of them will be and continue to be people of colour.
Thank you, Leslie, for sharing your thoughts there. I know that you touched upon Grenfell, and that is another, huge community case that you've been working on for the last few years. And I wondered again, obviously you, in the work that you do in terms of social justice, you're supporting people from all vulnerable communities. And I wondered if you could tell us a bit about Grenfell and how you got involved, and some of the work that you've done in that space.
Well, I for those of you who don't know me, I spend a lot of my time doing lots of inquests and inquiry work. That's what I'm known for, in addition to the police law that I do. And I was instructed by about 3 solicitors who have a number of Grenfell survivors or victims to be one of the Grenfell lawyers. There are many Grenfell lawyers working on the case, and I was very honoured to be asked to represent this diverse group of people. I think Grenfell, if anything, shows Grenfell shows the beauty of living in London and living in the UK at times, because it was a community of many people, very diverse, people from all over the world. But the tragedy is, because of the way that social housing has been underfunded and defunded over the decades, with the collapse of proper council housing, with the collapse of proper social housing, with people buying the government's allowing people to buy their homes and not replacing the housing stock, social housing has taken a hit. And with the hit that social housing has taken, homes haven't been properly maintained. There's been lots of disrepair, and shoddy and cheap materials have been used in the refurbishment and of homes. And I think when the Grenfell story is fully told, that is what we will discover. It's in the middle of being told at the moment, but we're already beginning to see a clear narrative coming out that those fantastic communities that were in Grenfell being treated as second-class citizens.
And Leslie, just to sort of start wrapping things up, you've covered a lot of hugely important topics today, and it's so wonderful for us to hear the type of work that you're doing and that you continue to do. But I just wondered, outside of the law and all these, very sort of important and quite heavy cases that you're working on, how do you relax? How have you kept yourself sane during lockdown? And can you tell us a bit about Leslie outside of the profession?
Well, there's two things that I used to do. One of them is I used to go on lots of long road trips on my motorbike, but since lockdown, I haven't been able to do that. So the bike's been locked away, gathering dust. But the other great love of my life is jazz music, and I'm a jazz saxophonist. And during lockdown, I've been spending my time just, practicing and composing. So I've been writing contrafacts to jazz standards. So that's where you have a well-known jazz tune, and then you write your own melody and superimpose it over a set of chord changes. So I've been doing lots of my own composition and practicing, and that just allows me to lose myself in that world of amazing music, and takes my mind off some of the harsher realities of life, whether that be what's happening with COVID in the world, what's happening in terms of our political handling of COVID, or indeed the tragic cases that I spend my lifetime working on. So that's what keeps me sane.
And will the album be dropping anytime soon? Can we hear any of your output anywhere? Do you have a YouTube channel, or do you have a secret social?
I'm not sure about that. I need to think about that.
Well, Leslie, it's always a real pleasure to talk to you, and I feel honoured every time to be in your presence and to hear the wisdom that you share with us all. So thank you so much from everyone at Chambers and Partners. And we really hope that we can meet in person soon and do another one of these interviews as well. Any final words?
No, just Dee, I know that you're doing some good work at Chambers, and I encourage you to push the diversity agenda, because I think it's really important. And I think everybody, including Chambers, needs to look, sit up and listen to what is happening in the world. Otherwise, what we don't want to be judged in a few years' time is being on the wrong side of history. And I know that you're trying to change and push that agenda. So, I'm happy to speak to you, because it encourages that topic and pushes that agenda. So thank you.
And as you say, it's all about collaboration as well, these conversations, and also action from the back of that. So absolutely thank you for your words. And that is something at Chambers and Partners we're looking to not only listen, but also to drive this agenda, globally, as we have that reach. So thank you for your words there, Leslie. And we look forward to hearing from you soon. Take care. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.